There's a lot of social justice issues that are going on. I was really anti-learning martial arts. I'm never going to learn it until I'm paid to learn it.
Sick, do that.
Welcome to CW, where representation matters and Asians can finally do Kung Fu. Well, okay, not that Asian, which is a pity because this series has some real protagonist problems. Of course, it also has quite a lot of other problems, and quite a lot of other characters as well. The main character's sister, brother, mother, father, the white love interest, the Asian love interest, the antagonist's love interest, and of course the Force Ghost who follows around our protagonist. It's never really explained. And each of these characters gets multiple storylines. The sister, for example, is organising her wedding in accordance with strict Chinese tradition. She's also a vigilante computer hacker, and she's trying to bring her rapist to justice, although not by using her vigilante computer hacker abilities. The brother, well, he's a doctor whose patients sometimes need more than just medical attention. He's also trying to raise funds to keep his clinic going, and he's hoping that his parents will accept him being gay, and his gay Black Lives Matter boyfriend. As for the Asian love interest, well, he's got a history of involvement with crime, which gives him access to an international network of mystical artifact thieves and smugglers. He also spent several years in China, learning to become a Kung Fu expert. And he's also a leading expert on mystical Chinese folklore, despite being an art student and Tai Chi teacher. So there are a lot of characters and a lot of plot lines. About 10 regular characters, and about 3 plot lines per character. This wouldn't be such a big problem if this was an ensemble show, but it's not. It's focused entirely on the one main character, and her season-long quest against, injustice, a quest for vengeance. So all of these other plot lines are really just filler, and that's a problem because they haven't really got time to fill. There are only 13 episodes. The season-long arc involves the main character searching for 8 mystical ancient weapons, and each episode also has a damsel in distress monster of the week plot to deal with. So with only 13 episodes, they don't really have time for filler. And this becomes a major problem, especially for the damsel in distress monster of the week episode plots. Each one is limited to only the spare space available in that episode when all the other plots have been dealt with. So the result is that each damsel in distress plot only gets 4 to 6 scenes to tell its entire story. This means there's no room for anything unpredictable or imaginative to happen. So let's look at one of these episodes. Let's look at episode 5, the episode starring real-life former world light heavyweight kickboxing champion Gary Daniels. Yeah, they got Gary Daniels to be in this. Real-life former world light heavyweight kickboxing champion Gary Daniels. They got him into this terrible series to be in this terrible episode, and he's in exactly 2 scenes. His entire storyline is only 4 scenes. In the first of those 4 scenes, someone goes to Henry the Tai Chi teacher to ask for help rescuing his sister from a Kung Fu cult. I've got no idea why anyone would go to Henry asking for help rescuing someone from a Kung Fu cult, but there you go. In the second scene, Gary Daniels appears for the first time. Nikki, our Kung Fu heroine, and Henry the Tai Chi teacher go to the gym used by the Kung Fu cult to ask some questions. They talk to the girl they're meant to be rescuing, and she really doesn't seem to want to be rescued. She talks about how the Kung Fu cult is helping her to deal with her PTSD, and the only real concerns that her brother had were that she's coming home with bruises and spending money, which seems pretty standard for joining a Kung Fu gym to me. So they arrange for Nikki to come back that night to have a Kung Fu fight with Gary Daniels as part of her induction into the Kung Fu cult. That's the entirety of the second scene of this storyline. Then we get to scene 3. And this scene is just Nikki sitting at home with her vigilante hacker sister, who tells her that the gym is actually selling pay-per-view access to their sparring sessions through the internet. Pay-per-view access to sparring sessions at a low-level gym where amateurs practice their kung fu in a place in California. This doesn't seem like a big money spinner, but that's what they're doing. Although we never actually get any evidence that Gary Daniels knows that this is going on. But because there are only 4 scenes, there can't be any twists. There's no chance that it's someone else, a character that hasn't been introduced yet, or maybe the brother who wanted his sister out of the Kung Fu cult. There's nothing else that can be done with this storyline except Gary Daniels is evil. And that brings us to the 4th and final scene in this storyline, the big fight where Nikki takes on Gary Daniels. And this scene makes absolutely no sense. They do a Kung Fu fight, okay? That makes sense. Except that Gary Daniels wins. Nikki is left incapacitated on the floor while he gives his victory speech, and then she gets up and pushes him, and apparently that means that she wins, and the entire gym gets shut down because all of his kung fu cult followers just sort of leave, looking downcast. Now, they didn't give any rules for this kung fu fight, so we don't know how he lost, we don't know why he lost. It certainly seemed like he had won, it seemed like he thought that he had won. And yet what actually happens is that he apparently loses. And meanwhile the hacker vigilante sister is at home, hacking into the pay-per-view system and shutting it all down. Now, I could believe that the tiny Asian girl could win a kung fu match against former real-life world light heavyweight kickboxing champion Gary Daniels, who is, after all, quite an old man. But you need to explain the rules so that we can actually tell that that's happened. And you also need to explain why that dooms his entire kung fu cult. Has he never lost a fight before? He is an old man, and he's got a lot of followers. You telling me that none of them have ever fought him? None of them have ever beat him? But you know, we got 4 scenes, so all we can do is, it ends with her beating him, and that's it. End of story. Whole thing shut down. So there wasn't enough room for the storyline to be able to breathe. There were no options to do anything else or anything creative, so Gary Daniels had to be evil. But that's not the only reason that Gary Daniels was evil, because Gary Daniels is also a white man, and that's something he's got in common with almost every other villain in this entire series. In fact, I went through to count how many white guys did not turn out to be evil, and the number is 2. One is the brother who's upset about his sister joining the Kung Fu cult in the Gary Daniels episode. He only appears in one scene. And the other is the white guy love interest, which is another thing which makes this series so predictable. As soon as you see a white guy, you know that's the villain. Every single time. And you might think this is just because it's a very Chinese series. Most of the people are Asians, so how many white guys can there be? And the answer is just enough to always be the bad guy. So let's have a look at an episode where they try to present the white guy as the bad guy and completely fail. Episode 2. The first episode after the pilot. And the episodic storyline starts with Nikki seeing a mugging and deciding to intervene, which she does by helping the mugger to steal from someone. And the reason for that is that the mugger is a teenage girl. And later in the episode she gives us her motivation. She wants to help her sisters. And in the context of having previously been in a kung fu monastery full of nuns, that makes sense. But this is also when she needs to learn some lessons. Lessons like, not every woman is your sister, not every woman is the same as the kung fu nuns that you're familiar with, and not all problems can be solved by doing kung fu. I know the series is called Kung Fu, but that's a lesson she's got to learn at some point. So she helps this teenage girl to steal a gun. And then she tracks this girl down, and the girl threatens to murder her with the gun. But then she explains why she needed the gun. She has an abusive stepfather, who doesn't actually seem to have been abusive at all, but we'll get to that. And so this girl threatens to murder her with the gun. But she tucks the girl down, and the girl gives her a sob story about her abusive background. But she doesn't actually mention any abuse. She claims that her stepfather is stealing money from her mother, and that does turn out to be true. But also the stepfather is looking after her mother, is providing housing, is taking care of her medical needs because she has long-term disabilities, and only asked the girl to leave after she had repeatedly tried to split them up. And the girl's response to this was to go and steal an unregistered firearm so that she could threaten to murder him and force her mother to leave him. Which makes me think he was probably in the right to try and get her the fuck out of his house. But Nikki is helping her sisters, so she can't think in those terms, and she decides to help to liberate this woman from her abusive stepfather. And she does this by taking her to the house where the stepfather and the mother live, so that the girl can talk her mother into leaving, and she does have to talk her into it. The mother is not being abused and doesn't want to leave. She leaves explicitly because her daughter is telling her to and is emotionally blackmailing her. She explicitly gives the reason she's leaving as she's going with her daughter, not that she wants to leave an abusive situation. And while they're having this conversation, the stepfather returns home. And that's when the violence starts. Not because of the dude who's supposedly abusive, but because of the kung fu heroine. She starts the violence. So this man comes home, and in his house he finds the girl that he previously threw out for trying to destroy his relationship, along with a woman he's never met before who tells him that he has to leave his house for several days, and that his girlfriend is leaving him. And his reaction to this is that he's not very happy. He's not happy with the situation, but he walks over to try and talk to his girlfriend. Obviously he's going to try and talk her into not leaving him, But instead of letting him do that, Nikki assaults him. She starts the violence, not him. She went into his house without his permission. She physically attacks him. She says that she's going to get a court order to order him to leave his home, which means that she hasn't got one yet. And then she holds him down and physically coerces him into leaving. Morally speaking, and legally speaking, this is a bad thing to do. But she does successfully force him to leave his home. So now he's out on the street and they all act as if this is problem solved. The two girls are going to end up getting into some sort of transitional housing, apparently at some point, and the mother's money will no longer be stolen by her boyfriend. So what happens next is that her boyfriend steals all of her money and everything from her safety deposit box, because obviously he would do. You know, he's a gambling addict. He's not a good person. He's just not abusive. He's not physically or emotionally or psychologically abusive. He just occasionally embezzles money because he's a gambling addict and it feeds his addiction. So now that he's been thrown out of his own home and lost his relationship and all the rest of it, he takes all the money that he can possibly get and he heads straight for the casino. And yeah, that's exactly what an addict would do. You get dumped, you get thrown out of your house, you get physically abused and humiliated, and you get all of those things happen to you in the same day. Of course, you're going to go and feed your addiction, which in his case means he steals all of the remaining money, which is $1,000, and takes it to the nearest casino. It's not a good thing to do, I'm not defending it. And so Nikki heads to the casino. She wants to regain the money, but the money's already been lost by the time she gets there, so she beats up all of the innocent security guards using her kung fu superpowers, and then makes off with $1,000 in cash. And I'm sure that'll be more than enough for those two women to set up a new and permanent housing situation for themselves in San Francisco, one of the most expensive real estate markets in the world. So, problem solved. And this is obviously a problem that goes beyond just being predictable to have the white guy always be the villain, which is that our main character is actually pretty evil. She resorts to violence immediately, because she never learns the lesson that kung fu doesn't solve all problems. She chooses whose side she's going to take, based solely on her bigotry and her prejudice about who is likely to be in the right, and that's a bad combination that often leads to her attacking innocent people for no reason, or just using excessive force. In episode 8 there's a bad guy, and of course he's a white guy, and somehow he's convinced a group of socialites to steal from their rich families for him. It's never explained how he's done this or what their motivation is, but that's how it works. And these are completely non-violent crimes. It's just a man and his coterie of teenage girls who rob from rich people who will never even miss most of the stuff that goes missing. And these crimes are completely non-violent until Nikki arrives and starts kicking the shit out of people. She doesn't call the police. She doesn't tell the girl's family. She just goes straight to violence. And Nikki tends to make a lot of bad choices. And those are the only choices she does make, because this is where we get to another major problem with the narrative of this series, which is that the whole thing is based on predestination caused by her mystical Chinese kung fu bloodline. That's right, she's not a kung fu master because of her years of training, but because of her bloodline, because it is predestined to be such. Only her social attitudes come from her background, and that gives her some very bad social attitudes, because her background is extremely privileged. She grew up in a relatively well-off family in San Francisco, then she went to the dorms at Harvard and Harvard Law School, and then she went to a kung fu monastery. So of course she thinks that all problems can be solved by kung fu. Of course she thinks that the girl who reminds her of one of the kung fu nuns will obviously be the good guy. How could she think anything else? She really seemed quite angry to realise that free will is an illusion, and that all of her decisions were driven by predestination and mystical bloodlines. I suppose that's an understandable response. I was quite annoyed too. Nothing really undermines your characters like realising that they don't have free will, and that all of their journeys meant nothing, and all of their decisions didn't even come from them. But I don't want to sound like our main character's only characteristics are being prejudiced, violent, and lacking in agency. She's also very stupid. Let's have a look at the Black Lives Matter episode. So there's a Black Lives Matter related incident, and there's a Black Lives Matter protest, and the police break it up with violence and tear gas and so forth, and some of the black people, because all of the Black Lives Matter activists are black, go and hide in the Chinese restaurant. and then the police turn up with an arrest warrant. And there are several things that you can do in this situation which could be useful. You could start gathering money to pay for bail, because in America it's all cash bail. You could phone a lawyer. You could start looking for evidence that he's innocent. You could get the contact details of all of the people from the demonstration, so that they can then give their witness testimony to the police. What you shouldn't do is this. They actually do I'm Spartacus. And remember, Nikki was 3 weeks away from graduating from Harvard Law School. But she doesn't realise that an arrest warrant has a specific name on it, and you can't just arrest anyone just because you have an arrest warrant, and you certainly can't sacrifice yourself to stop someone else from getting arrested. So that's pretty stupid. That is pretty stupid. Luckily the hacker vigilante sister is there, and she does some hacker vigilantism by searching through Instagram and finding footage of the speech that he gave, which proves that the suspect wasn't in fact inciting a riot. At least not at that particular moment. We don't see the entire speech. And obviously the police see the error of their ways and turn their backs and walk out in shame. Not realistic, but I suppose that's the happy ending. But as well as stupidity, she also has another important trait. Superpowers. She has superpowers. She can run on a broken leg, which is pretty good. There is an episode where she is chased through the woods by a wolf. First the wolf steals her bag, for some reason, and she breaks her leg. She puts a splint on the leg and improvises a crutch so that she can walk. And then the wolf comes back and she sprints on her broken leg. That was a pretty good scene. Like that one. Then there's the scene where she is locked in a cupboard. The cupboard has a normal, rather flimsy looking door, and it visibly shakes when she hits it. It also opens outwards, so it ought to be very easy to kick open. But she doesn't kick it open. Instead she punches it so hard that her fist goes right through it, but only after meditating. And all these superpowers come from something called Bianca, which is a glowing green energy found in the 8 ancient mystical weapons. Although legit historians say there was no magic. Yeah, you know what I'm saying. So the glowing green energy magic first appears in the pilot episode, where Nikki finds the magic sword of the woman who will later be the Force Ghost following her around. And this magic is so powerful that when Nikki merely touches the weapon, it burns itself into her hand, and she maintains those scars until the last episode. Which is strange, because later on other people touch that weapon and other weapons, and even though they have the glowing green energy, they don't burn people. So let's talk about the season-long arc, which is horribly rushed, because again, everything is squeezed in to far too few episodes. So there is a mystical force called Bianca, and it is contained in 8 mystical weapons. Each weapon has 2 mystical bloodlines. Protagonist and antagonist both come from these mystical bloodlines, and while the antagonist is seeking the mystical weapons for power, the protagonist only wants to stop her, mainly because of revenge. So this is another flaw with our protagonist. She only wants revenge, and that's the only reason she's doing any of this. But she's also very incompetent, so she doesn't end up with any of the weapons. The antagonist beats her to each and every one, but because it's horribly rushed, we don't really see that. The antagonist gets several weapons off screen. On one occasion, she gets 3 of them in a single episode. That's just ridiculously rushed. It's absurd. But that gets us to the one good thing about this series, which is the antagonist. The best actress and by far the best character. And the antagonist, Jilan. Jilan is really the only character who actually has an arc. She gets an arc where she learns that there are other important things besides revenge, which is also her initial motivation. She gets a love interest who she has to sacrifice for her cause, so she does eventually choose the revenge, but still, she does have that arc. And we see her making difficult decisions, trying to do things, putting forward effort. We see her having the difficult emotional scenes, which is really good for the actress, and isn't something that the main character gets. So easily the best character. And that brings us to the last issue that I want to talk about, which is that all of these people are Asian. And I think that's a problem. I know the history. I know that the original Kung Fu hired David Carradine, a white man, instead of Bruce Lee, who is Bruce Lee. That was probably a bad decision. But let's not pretend that this is striking a blow for racial equality. Having Asians do Kung Fu is not breaking new ground. But narratively, I think it's actually better to have a non-Asian lead in a Kung Fu property. A non-Asian lead can be more sympathetic to a larger part of the audience, the non-Asian part of the audience. A non-Asian lead can have a cultural clash with the other kung fu people. A non-Asian lead can be a better viewpoint character for the audience, going into the world of kung fu and seeing things, and the audience seeing things through their eyes. On the other hand, an Asian lead could also be good. But here we really have the worst of both worlds, because the Asian lead is racially Asian, but is very much a normal California girl. A normal California girl who went to Harvard Law School and then spent only a couple of years in a Chinese kung fu monastery, and now she's got superpowers. Honestly, I would probably have gone with black people. Black people love kung fu. But there's also a problem with the specific Asian lead in the show, which is that she took a public stand against martial arts, and she actually puts in a pretty good performance in the show. But it's a problem that they chose to cast a woman who took a public stand against learning martial arts as the lead in a series called Kung Fu. And we all know that the reason for that is that they cast her because she's a hot Asian girl. This is just the same as the David Carradine and Bruce Lee thing. They chose to go not in the direction of martial arts, but in the direction of someone who would be popular with the audience. Nowadays that means hot Asian girl instead of martial arts practitioner. And so next, I suppose it's probably time to watch season 2.
We'd see a sister in need, we'd help.
These sisters you speak of, were any of them packing heat?